I want to make an overture on the philosophy of contract theory, and also I want to make an overture on, let's call it the abstemious nature towards drugs that we have as well in society. And a few thinkers certainly obtrude when we think about the idea of social contract, something that I've reverberated maybe in other videos and also principally in my book. But I think what's very important to consider when we think about contract theory is the idea of the Fertile Crescent, which is often elided. Why? Because when we think about the domestication of our plant and animal species around 10,000 years ago, what's implicated within that is also the accessibility that we have with drugs. So again, we have to think about climate, we have to think about continental drift, we have to think about all of those types of causal determinants that would render things like cocaine being accessible to people, marijuana, whether you think sativa or indica, and the domestication of those plants to be consumed in the way it is today. Like, this is a process that happened over millennia, so I think it's very important for us to necessitate. And so there's that part, the Fertile Crescent, in terms of its causal deterministic regard. But what I like about Rousseau is that he necessitates the morality of it, and he brings in, let's call it utilitarianism. So maybe in other videos I talked about a teleological eudaimonia in terms of normative ethics. But what I like about Rousseau is that he necessitates deontology and he necessitates utilitarianism. And so what he uses is a balance sheet, and something that I've replicated in my book as well. So let's say that the conditions within the social contract that are stipulated outweigh, in terms of the balance sheet, they outweigh in assets as opposed to the conditions that might be against what he calls the will of all. So against conditions that you might render somewhat injurious or somewhat unprofitable on your behalf. So let's talk about the two types of will. So I say this as a causal determinist. So one type of will that he talks about is the will of all. And the will of all is something that is predicated upon the id. And then the dichotomy of that is the general will. And the general will is what I would render utilitarian in its sense, in that the general will of all, so something like civility, or having civilized spaces where people don't have to worry about people attacking you, those types of places are very good. And so this one's good for the libertarian. So Rousseau forces you to ask a few questions, and when compelled to confront this notion, the libertarian has to ask, are you more free if you are free to consume alcohol, or are you more free if you are compelled to leave alcohol given the effects of alcohol? And I think this is a very important question to ask when we think about free will and we think about what might be deleterious to you over, let's say, elapsing a provisional amount of time, right? And this is what separates us from other species as well in terms of long-term deferment. This is very important when we necessitate the morality of free will and when we think about social contract theory. So in terms of the abstemious nature that we have against any type of drugs, which is what I would certainly claim, is I created a pentagonal prism of agency. And my pentagonal prism, for me, is something profitable under the social contract because of its abstemious sense against things that could toxify individuals working within this social contract, this social covenant that we have, that would render society profitable. And so in terms of political philosophy, I do believe that considering the domestication of our plants, it might be a lot more profitable for us to render drugs illegal in many parts. And this is against the provisional type of sense. Well, I think it works neurologically. I think it coincides with your dopaminergic system, right? In terms of how we work with dopamine and how we work when we think about a functioning society. And so I don't want to push forward the Rousseauistic sense of philosophy too much, but I certainly think it's worth thinking about when we think about things being profitable and when we think about the act of the will, the general will versus the will of all.